This is the final project presentation for my research study in this course. And just a heads up before I get started, the recording software that I'm using only enables me to record for up to 10 minutes. So I will have this done in two parts to avoid cutting off my presentation. So the first one is my introduction, and my introduction is totally stemmed on my love for traveling and my love for language. So I decided that my research study would be about foreign language programs in the European Union compared to those of the United States. My reasoning for this is that the more that can be understood about the strengths, weaknesses, and attitudes towards foreign language programs, the more inclined the world is to having multilingual individuals who are culturally competent and care about others. I think in the midst of all of the political unrest happening around the world, it would just be amazing to recognize simply knowing someone else's language and with knowing that language, knowing a bit about one's culture would go a long way in helping alleviate some of the tension between nations that are currently fighting. The other piece in this too is I read a study for another class that I'm taking, and the study was talking about multilingualism and how it almost always is linked with giftedness and a child's ability to interact with multiple languages and cultures and call on them accordingly when necessary in conversation and reading and writing is actually quite a skill. And that's something that I feel is not emphasized enough in the United States. And so I'll talk more about that in a minute. So, with motivation, my motivation for this study stems completely from a recent trip that I took in February. My friend and I met in Amsterdam in Holland, and then we drove to Germany, Luxembourg, and Belgium. And this trip had me interacting with multilingual individuals from all walks of life, some of whom were young, some of whom were older, whether it be asking for directions or recommendations or just people that I met that I befriended. Every single person that I met within these four countries spoke at least four languages, if not five. And I wanted to learn more about how this group of people in Europe were capable of having such linguistic success, particularly when academic institutions themselves are quite similar to those in the United States, from what I assume. And yet, in the United States, multilingualism is not emphasized, quite frankly, in my opinion, at all. And I just wanted to understand the relationship between the United States and especially the European Union, since all four of these countries are within that. And when I was going about this study, I was reading different articles about policies in the European Union. And I believe it's 27 national languages are represented, and every single formal documentation that is provided for the European Union is provided in every single one of those national languages so that everyone who is a citizen of the EU can feel as though their national language is being represented, their national identity is being represented within this larger whole. And basically, I just wanted to see if there were specific attitudes, motivating factors, and or anxieties that helped or inhibited students in the US and the EU. And then I wanted to compare the two sets to see if there were observable reasons why foreign language programs are thriving in the EU and are not thriving based on my observations as a teacher in the United States, that these programs are not thriving in the United States. So that was kind of what motivated this study. And the different articles that I read in light of this study really helped shape my research questions. So my research questions, I left them open-ended on purpose, and part of me regrets that decision because it made this whole empirical study all the more difficult. But at the same time, I think it allowed the presence of other factors to be present. So anyway, my research questions, the first one is, how do the methods that teachers employ and the amount of time using the target language in class affect the attitude, motivation, anxiety, and enjoyment of the learners? So this question, basically the idea of having the question worded the way that it is to analyze what teachers are doing in the classroom in the EU and the US in these foreign language classrooms and compare them to how the student perceives the foreign language is meaningful to his or her life and will help them find a future job and things of that nature. Like really important reasons why we have academic institutions in the first place is so that students will be able to go and be contributing members in society. And what are language programs helping that goal? And if not, why are we studying them? And what is the teacher doing that makes the language learning process feel meaningful to the student or not? So that was what that was. And so there are two different data sets. One is with what the teacher is actually doing, the amount of time spent, the direct expectations of what students are expected to be doing, actively participating in the language learning process versus how the student feels and perceives the class as meaningful for his or her life. And then, so that was part one. The other question is what other factors, such as integration of technology in the classroom, affect the meaningfulness of foreign language learning? And the reasoning behind this question is kind of acknowledging that there was likely to be a myriad of factors that I hadn't even anticipated before embarking on this study. And I wanted to leave it open that I could still incorporate them into my research study as I observed them. But I specifically talked about technology because I think this makes the study all the more relevant in the 21st century, knowing that technology is, it should be ubiquitous in the classroom due to the fact that students will have to use technology in their future jobs, most likely, particularly in these developed countries such as the United States and all the countries within the European Union. So technology was a particular focus, especially having read a few articles that discussed how teachers are integrating technology in the classroom and or not, and how it's effective or not, and all of that. So that was one factor, and I use it as an example to set the tone for other factors becoming present as the study unfolded, what students responded in terms of their anxiety, their enjoyment, what motivated them, how they perceived the class to be meaningful to their lives, how it compared to the expectations of their other core classes, things of that nature. And the survey, the way that it was set up, the survey enabled students to respond more deeply with any of the questions on the survey because it was built on a Likert scale of 1 to 5 that students could then go and on the back of the paper kind of go more in depth with a handful of questions if they felt so inclined. And so it left room for if they said, yeah, I'm really anxious because my parents don't see any meaning for this, or it's so different from expectations in my other classes, or I'm not enjoying this because my teacher doesn't have me, we don't use the language kind of that we talk about it in English or in Dutch, whatever the circumstance is. So it just opened up the door for whatever students replied on the survey if they took initiative to dive deeper into the survey, that I could incorporate that into my study without having to fill out a second IRB application because that was quite a laborious process. So moving on to my hypotheses, I had a handful, and they might seem pretty obvious just based on what I've said thus far with my observations and my own personal experience when traveling in a few countries within the EU. But my observations of my trip in Europe and the copious amounts of literature I read about foreign language programs in the EU led me to hypothesize that students studying foreign languages in the EU will have more positive attitudes, higher motivation, and higher enjoyment rates than those in the United States. And kind of accompanying that, it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, that they would have lower anxiety rates than those of the United States. So just basically every positive factor of learning a foreign language would be higher in the students in the EU versus the United States. And my reasoning for the hypothesis is just simply based on my own observation. When I was doing my internship for this graduate program, I was observing the Spanish teacher in the middle school, and the comments that I would hear, I have the students in my own class, and the way that they treated Senor Leva was drastically different from the way that they treat me. And then moreover, I anticipate that teachers in the EU will earn higher scores on their lessons than foreign language programs. But I'm approaching the end of my recording limit, so I'm going to pause here and I'll jump back in my next recording.